Okay, I think we can start right now. So I want to welcome everybody who joined the ISP's workshop about news and information disorder in the 2020 presidential election. And I really appreciate all the kinds of amazing speakers' contribution about their variable perspectives and research on information disorder this presidential election. So we invite all the kinds of the different fields of scholars who has done research on this topic or has a variable reflection on this topic. So I also thanks for the moderators who moderate the sessions, and also thanks for Knight Media Foundation support for these workshops happening. So the workshop will be recorded except the open Q&A with the audience. And for each session, the speakers will present their brief perspectives or brief research statement about the information disorder this election. And then the moderator will ask general questions to the speakers. And after that, we move to open Q&A with the audience. So, so when you ask a question, you can use the raise your hand function in the Zoom, or you can just leave your questions in the chat. So I also, okay, so I want to welcome again to everybody, and I introduce briefly about our first session speakers. So the first session is about the creation and spreading of false information and political discussion. So we have the three speakers on this session. First of all, we have Sam Gill, who is a Senior Vice President and Chief Program Officer at Knight Media Foundation, and also Andrew Gaze, who is Assistant Professor of Politics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. And also, I share my research with my collaborators in the first session. So, and we have Leah Ferentinos, who is a Communication Agent Fellow of the ISP, to moderate this session. So I move my mic to Leah. So Leah, just can you start the session? And I'm happy to hear all the amazing kinds of speakers' perspectives and research.
Great. Thank you, Jisoo, for organizing this conference. I just wanted to, again, welcome our first set of speakers. And who did we decide was going to go first? Was it Sam or Andrew?
We decided on Andy.
Andy?
I'm happy to go first.
I'd like to welcome Andy Guess, Assistant Professor of Politics and Public Affairs at Princeton University, to speak to us about misinformation research 4 years later.
Great, thanks a lot. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Jisoo, and everyone else for organizing. So first, I just want to say that I thought I would take a somewhat different approach for me, and instead of sort of presenting my latest findings, I would use this opportunity to sort of take stock of where we are. And by we, I mostly mean researchers who study these kinds of phenomena, but also policymakers and everyone in this, basically everyone at this event. And I think the great advantage of having an event like this is that it allows us to sit back and reflect, especially after what I perceive to be a fairly disorienting series of months, for all of the topics that we're concerned about. So many of us are here because we've joined this sort of wave of research and policy interest into various forms of misinformation that's gone hand in hand with a lot of increased scrutiny on social platforms and their role in facilitating it. So in my reflection piece, I summarize some of the great work that's been done studying the descriptive and causal questions around the role of online misinformation and disinformation. A lot of the work focuses on identifying effective ways of counteracting it, especially within the sort of bounds of feasible interventions by platforms themselves. This is very much an area of research that I'm involved with as well. So just to sort of summarize extremely crudely, a lot of this work centers around things like fact checks, factual corrections, or strategies like inoculation or accuracy nudges that it is hoped sort of can provide more longer lasting boosts to people's ability to discern, high quality versus low quality information on social media. This past year, an extraordinary amount of effort went into preparations to avoid the more foreseeable harms from social media misinformation. And of course, the pandemic provided the additional challenge of combating rampant misinformation and rumors about the virus. A somewhat surprising result of all of this has been an increased willingness by the platforms to employ more aggressive tactics designed to reduce the spread of misleading content, such as vaccine skepticism, but also things like voter fraud. So I think that's a very interesting development. At the same time, a number of, I think, the threats that a lot of people anticipated never really reared their heads. So I would put under that category things like major foreign influence operations, at least that we can detect so far, and things like deepfakes, which have received a lot of attention in the past couple of years. So the results, I think, is that the bounds of the feasible interventions by platforms has radically expanded before our eyes in a pretty short period of time. So that includes things like banning ads, adding frictions to make it harder for certain types of content to spread, taking down posts, and aggressively signal boosting higher quality authoritative information. To me, at least, it certainly seems like these efforts probably had a big impact. We can't know for sure because a lot of the evidence we would need is not public. But some of the results that we've seen reported publicly seem to be pretty impressive. And if I were to find effect sizes of this kind in any research that I did, I would be very happy. In other words, my maybe sort of provocative take here is that some of the most promising and aggressive approaches now being used by platforms, for the time being at least, haven't really been the subject of a lot of the research that many of us have been doing on how to combat misinformation up to now. So I think that these developments should prompt reflection among researchers, among those with a policy interest, and among foundations and funders about the best way forward for research on misinformation. I don't claim to really have all the answers here, but I sort of welcome the discussion. Just a few quick thoughts though, while I'm here. So first, I think that fact checks are a really important part of the toolkit for confronting misinformation, but we should also acknowledge their limitations. I also think it's fair to say that a lot of the content that we think has been most objectionable during the past election campaign in the US and also over the past year hasn't always been subject to strict factual verification in the first place. That's arguably the case with a lot of posts that preemptively delegitimize elections, where there's a lot of insinuation. It's arguably true for things like QAnon. Facebook very prominently just took down massive networks of QAnon content and groups. But sort of trying to fact check a widespread conspiracy theory of this kind, I think often feels like trying to fact check a religion. It's sort of missing the point. Sort of my second thought here is that given our track record in trying to anticipate the really important developments with regard to online misinformation, it hasn't been that great. And so we should stop trying to predict the next big thing, which could be the next platform, the next harmful technological development, because we'll always be playing catch up. Instead, I think the kinds of people who are here in this panel should think about really doubling down on basic research of the kind that there is already quite a bit already underway. So really trying to understand the fundamental individual and structural factors combining to produce a state of information disorder, regardless of the specific circumstances or platforms that are dominant at any given time. So my third general point is that I think we're going to see that the focus of criticisms towards platforms is going to quickly shift from whether or not to make exceptions for political leaders from kind of longstanding policies and towards other things. And I think it's going to be making it increasingly difficult for the platforms to avoid making hard choices. about content policy and community standards. And so I would just say, based on the observations I've made, that we've arguably just seen a successful demonstration of what a principled and tractable post-Trump content moderation regime could look like, that's centered around discouraging the flow of democratically corrosive messages, broadly understood. And this could accomplish a few goals. One, it enables community standards designed to promote democracy-enhancing expression. Two, moves us away from this free speech frame that often all the players in these debates seem to sort of have agreed upon, yet I think sort of distorts the debate in subtle ways. And third, it sort of moves us away from a narrow true versus false dichotomy that again, I think sort of asks too much of fact checkers and ignores a lot of the skewed or misleading content that could even have a superficial factual basis. So I hope that these thoughts will help us learn from this recent experience with on-the-fly policy adaptation, both to improve the sort of advice that we have to offer, but also to help us gain a deeper understanding of the causes and consequences of online misinformation. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Andy, for those thoughts. I'd like to welcome our next speaker. Is Sam going next or Jisoo?
Yeah, I can go. Thank you. Thanks, Leah, and thanks. I'll echo thanks to Jack and Nick and Jisoo, and everyone who's logged in from the West Coast for the first session. I don't want to be guilty of contributing to information disorder, so it's important to disclose I'm not a researcher. Although I'm a fan of many of you, and I focused my blog post and will focus my comments on the question of the harm of information disorder and misinformation and how we might go about measuring it. And what I proposed in my piece is that we take an approach to descriptive research that's bounded both by normative considerations and, kind of borrowing a term from linguistics, what I would call diachronic considerations. Which is to say that we assess first high priority harm and then shape descriptive inquiry in a way that's informed by, kind of history in quotation marks, as temporal and spatial context. And so I'll use my time this morning to discuss a bit about why I think election related information disorder in particular has disclosed this opportunity, some of what I see as the potential benefits of it, and then a bit of a wider view that grounds my approach. So first on the election, it seems to me that 2020 has been the year in which, what you might call time, place, manner considerations with regard to harm related to digital content have just become clear to everybody. The election is an obvious example, and most of the debate within the companies after the first order questions of what kind of content to block were really questions about when to block it and when those policies would be relevant. COVID obviously led to some substantial changes in the way that companies approach health-related misinformation. Facebook's big announcement yesterday was that they're really reversing course around vaccine-related misinformation with regard to COVID in particular. I'd actually also argue that some of what we saw around wildfires on the West Coast speak to this. Antifa conspiracy theories were just much more pernicious for people living in rural Oregon than they might be in other places. I also think that 2020 has been the year in which the research community, represented by all of you, has begun to move us away in a clear, more forceful, and more thoroughgoing way away from an implied colorblind and genderblind, quote, user as the affected party in the context of information disorder. I think we're becoming much more clear from a research perspective about the role of identity in the structure of harm and the transmission of harm. And I think that's also going to open the door to drawing on more well-established doctrines about identity-based harm, like suspect classification and disparate impact, things which really have not figured in a lot of the policy discussions about how to respond to information disorder. And so I think, what this illustrates is to me is that we really don't care about all harm equally, even as a descriptive matter. What we should care about is measuring the prevalence and effects of information disorder on some kind of prioritarian scale. And so what I'm calling a diachronic approach would mean using context to assess digital information phenomena on that scale. And the two key dimensions, at least that come to mind for me, are one, temporal. So this is the when question. And the second is spatial. And here I would think in terms of who has been affected. And I think elections and pandemics are two really good categories to be thinking about how to structure and approach research. I don't think we need to overthink this, and there might be other kinds of low-hanging fruit that can help to gate or shape descriptive inquiry. And there are probably better examples, but two that I thought about in the context of the piece that I put together were critical infrastructure sectors, which have been a mainstay now of US domestic security policy since immediately post 9/11, as well as the way that disparate impact data is collected in the service of fair housing obligations at state and local levels. These examples illustrate to me that we're perfectly capable of wrapping our minds around the idea of a diachronic focus and harm and the role of circumscribed and especially protected data collection across public and private sectors when there is some diachronically informed interest in descriptive research. So, what are some of the benefits of the approach? In the piece, I suggest three. The first is that it just makes this research more manageable practically and can narrow the lens on what we think we need to be looking at. The second is that, as Andy's mentioned and is always the theme of these conversations, which is the data access question, I actually think this provides a very useful constraint to data sharing questions. And I suspect that more tailored requests to companies will not only be practically useful, but will allow for a stronger normative claim that data ought to be turned over in some fashion to researchers. I think companies will remain reluctant to open up data en masse. I think they will be able to hide under the aegis of other affirmative privacy obligations. I think it's much more compelling to say, we really need to understand what happened in the month of November on your platforms with regard both to the transmission of information disorder and misinformation, but to Andy's point, to start to look at these interventions that were far more systematic than they have been in the past. And there are some good examples of this. I mean, I think what Airbnb is starting to do around race is an example of the power of having a normatively tailored request for information sharing. And I think the third benefit is that this approach may help us to reconcile some of the upstream downstream questions that are becoming really important in the wake of the election about the interaction between digital harm and other social and political pathologies. I would use the diachronic lens in the same way that Meryl Sanger in epidemiology talks about syndemics, the relationship between an epidemiological phenomenon and a social phenomenon as driving the spread of disease. I'd like to conclude by kind of grounding this point of view in a somewhat wider perspective. It seems to me, and I think as informed by the research of many of you, that internet and internet-enabled commerce are clearly part of a range of phenomena that are challenging democratic capitalism and neoliberal governmentality. Issues like racial inequity and material inequality are obviously important in this. Issues like the atrophying of critical institutions, both governmental and non-governmental, journalism, unions, et cetera, is critical in this. But part of the issue clearly is that the technocratic administrative state that emerged to meet managerial capitalism is just not up to the task of meeting informational and surveillance capitalism, at least as configured today. And I think it's not an accident, looking at that era, the era in which the administrative state was formulated, that some of the earliest codifications of the administrative state during the progressive era were, for example, the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act and the 1906 Federal Meat Inspection Act, which were signed on the same day, which is not coincidence. And one of the most substantial contributions of these acts was to create an apparatus for descriptive research about those industries that was connected to regulatory reform. So both of those acts not only introduced the idea that there ought to be an expert authoritative workforce that had claims on proprietary information, but they also introduced early ideas of labeling, that we should know something about what, as consumers and as citizens, about what was discovered in the course of those expert investigations. And this, of course, was in response to both the harm, which was clear, but also the benefit. The reality was industrial production of food and medicine dramatically lowered the costs of these materials. It also introduced the idea that sawdust might be a part of what we were consuming, and we had to somehow address both of these things. And it seems to me that we're doing the research that we're talking about today for a reason, which is that we're analyzing digital industrial supply chains, concatenations of data and transactions for pathologies, malevolent and unconscious, so that we can mitigate the harm and continue to reap the benefit. And most of our descriptive research, it seems to me, should support a normative agenda along these lines. So thanks a lot for the opportunity to participate in this discussion.
Thank you so much for your comments. We will definitely hear more about this during the Q&A. and I look forward to that. Next up, I'd like to welcome Jisoo Kim, our lovely organizer of this conference. She's a resident fellow at the ISP, and she's presenting research with Soo-Jung Kim that she wrote on, hold on, I have it right here.
I can start.
Yeah, you can start. On negative misinformation about Trump and Biden.
So thanks for all the kinds of the general perspectives and amazing variable perspectives about the information disorder from Andy and Sam. My kinds of the presentation is more related to some kinds of specific research project I'm designing about the relationship between organizations that fact check misinformation and the publics. So especially I'm interested in the effects of perceived bias of the fact-checking organizations or media organizations who fact-checked misinformation about political candidates. So kind of, especially as a journalism scholars, I'm interested in the news organization's role in fact-checking of misinformation. So think about during the election. So not only the fact-checking organizations, now news organizations also collaborate with fact-checking organizations or verified what politicians said in their speech or any kinds of rumors and conspiracy theories on social media platforms. But however, think about, unlike the fact-checking organizations, media organizations, there are specific group of audiences usually trust some media organization like Fox News or CNN based on their political predispositions. That means that since news organizations try to appeal to the majority group of their audiences, there might be perceived bias in their reporting, even for the fact-checking news articles. So for example, news organization could report news favorably toward about specific politicians, or by overly correcting negative misinformation about the politicians, or only selectively reporting positive misinformation about the specific political candidates. So in this case, for my collaborators and I conduct an online experiment to examine the effect of news articles that corrects negative misinformation about the presidential candidates during this election, especially Trump and Biden, published by Fox News and CNN, which are usually coded as a conservative or liberal media organization in our society. So we examine if the public perceives Fox News favors Trump or CNN favors Biden, how do they evaluate the credibility of news articles differently that fact-check the misinformation about Trump or Biden? And what is the effect of fact-checking articles about the politicians on their impression or evaluation of the political candidates? So we borrow the ranking theory in the communication field that explains information perceived as not being manipulated by the person to whom it refers in the information is considered valuable and credible. So the public thinks there is a favorable relationship between the Fox News and Trump or Biden and CNN. They might evaluate the news articles that fact-check negative misinformation about Trump or Biden's less credible, especially based on their political predisposition. So more specifically, by applying this theory, we tested Fox News articles that corrects negative misinformation about Trump, and CNN news articles that corrects negative misinformation about Biden should be perceived as less credible than the opposite. So because based on the favorable relationship between Trump and Fox News and CNN and Biden. And this evaluation can be different depending on the public's political predisposition. So right after the election, we conducted an online experiment that showed 4 news articles from Fox News and CNN that correct negative misinformation about Trump and Biden. For one group, they received the Fox News articles that correct negative misinformation about Trump, and CNN news articles that correct negative misinformation about Biden. And the other group, participants received the Fox News articles that correct negative misinformation about Biden, and CNN news articles that corrected negative misinformation about Trump. So before showing the news articles, we gave the public information about the relationship between Trump and Fox News and Biden and CNN to kind of manipulate the manipulation likelihood of the news organization that correct the misinformation about the political candidates. And we will do next experiment soon in December, but the preliminary findings from the experiment show that only among liberals, the favorable relationship between Trump and Fox News negatively affect participants' evaluation about the news article's credibility. And however, conservative participants evaluate the credibility of news articles even when the manipulation likelihood of the news organization's favor toward Trump existed. So maybe you can assume that that's only based on the participants' preference or their trust in specific news organizations, but the news articles that correct negative misinformation about Biden, there is no relationship like that kinds of the effect of the relationship between news organizations and politicians on participants' evaluation of news articles or their political candidates' evaluation too. So, and we also measure the political candidates evaluation, how the public evaluate the political candidates. And when they read news articles favorable to one of the politicians from the news organizations, perceived as having a positive relationship with the politicians, their evaluations of both politicians become less positive in general. So maybe that kinds of the relationship between media organizations and politicians gives some kinds of the participants become more skeptical toward the political candidates. However, when we consider political predispositions, liberals show some tendencies toward when they receive the news articles from CNN that fact-check the Trump's negative misinformation and Fox News articles that correct negative misinformation Trump, they tend to evaluate the Biden as more positively. So for the kinds of key takeaway points from there, so it seems that the public becomes more skeptical or favorable toward fact-checking information when it comes from news organizations perceived as having a favorable relationship with the politicians the information refers based on their political predispositions. I think that's problematic because it can make the polarization between liberals and conservatives worse, even it corrects negative misinformation about the politicians. And this kind of relationship can be applied to the relationship between the platforms or other fact checkers and politicians, how these kinds of the perceived relationship between those two actors can affect the credibility of fact checking information and also their public's the evaluation about the politicians. So in terms of the implication for news organizations to become objective fact checkers in our society with fact checking organizations, it's very important for news organizations to consider how audiences perceive the relationship between the news organizations and the politicians when they publish the fact checking news articles that might be potentially favorable toward either conservative or liberal politicians. So thanks for listening to my presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Jisoo. And thank you to everyone for their comments and their presentations. I'd just like to kind of collate everyone's research a little bit and to ask a general question about fact checking. So what I've kind of heard from the three of you is the importance, the potential, and the limitations around fact checking misinformation and political ideas online. And I'd just like to ask about information bubbles and how we actually reach people with this fact-checking information. Now, I heard a little bit about platforms doing this. I heard a little bit about the potential for other types of organizations to do this. And I was just wondering, it doesn't really matter who goes first. Feel free to jump in whenever you want. But the actual ability to reach and potentially influence or not different people's perceptions on information. And so just any thoughts would be awesome.
I'm happy to jump in if you'd like.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So I think this question about how to ensure that fact checks and sort of corrective information reaches people is really important. I've done some research on this with Brendan Knight and Jason Reifler. So we basically wanted to see how often is it the case that people who are likely to hold certain misperceptions actually encounter fact checks about those misperceptions, and the answer is just extremely rarely. And there's sort of a fundamental mismatch between sort of the regular consumers of fact checks and people who are people who hold misperceptions or perhaps distrust those fact checking organizations in the first place. And so maybe sort of this is a surprising answer, but I almost think that platforms can be part of the solution here, because they are one of the few entities that actually have the reach and the ability to boost the likelihood that people encounter kind of high quality information. And one of the key findings from this research that I mentioned is that if you actually do show people who wouldn't normally encounter a fact check in the wild, some sort of a fact checking article, it still works for those people as well as it would work for anyone else who actually would prefer to see that kind of content. And so arguably there is not that much of a downside to sort of trying to increase the likelihood that people encounter fact checks and sort of put it in front of people who are sort of less likely consumers of that kind of information. So I think this sort of thing can generally increase the amount of factual information people encounter and potentially also counteract the tendencies for like information cocoons to form.
Well, in addition to Andy's point, I think that's really interesting to think about. Well, even though publics can go to fact checker organization first to get the information, but maybe people have different weights on which information they need to accept. So probably maybe we need to think about, well, people can get information from fact checker organizations, but also media organization and their friends on social media or directly from the politicians. And maybe there should be the different effects of which source they can get the fact checking information that corrects the misinformation about the politicians. And maybe if they receive the counting kinds of information from different sources, what is the kind of the effect of those kinds of things? So I think that's also an interesting thing we need to think about.
Only addition, I mean, I think, one, I would sort of refer to Andy's point about some of the structural considerations being more important. I think this year has really brought that home. I also think that given that several of the platforms took sort of multifarious approaches to combinations of things like fact checking and signal boosting, I think comparing some of those approaches and how they affected similar users would shed some important insights. The other, and I think David Rand might be participating today. I mean, I sort of see him as the authority on a lot of these questions about different formats for fact checking. But one thing I think has been certainly been eye-opening for me in thinking about Knight Foundation's work with journalists in particular is that I think sometimes I think there is something deceptive and illusory about even imagining there's some small subset of people out there who are just really looking for accurate information. But I think something that's not misleading is that journalists and news organizations themselves are struggling to keep up with the speed of the internet and are actually one of the most robust audiences for fact checking. And so I think there's actually sort of a much more brute, blunt, mechanistic approach to fact checking, which is to figure out ways that existing democratic institutions that are designed to provide contextual information to people who want it can be in better dialogue with the kinds of information transmission happening on platforms. I think what we're also learning, I don't know if Joan Donovan's joining today, but journalism organizations not only miss opportunities to correct misinformation, they contribute to the amplification of misinformation when they fail to have really timely and accurate fact checking, particularly about, obviously not vaccine related misinformation or election procedure related misinformation, but things like QAnon, things that start to border on the conspiratorial.
Thank you so much to everyone's comments. Now I know we're kind of approaching the audience Q&A, unless anyone has any more thoughts on this. And so I just kind of like to open it up to the audience, and I'll be kind of monitoring the raise hand function in Zoom. So if anybody wants to raise their hand, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. And if you can't unmute yourself, I'll try to do it for you. So I think this is the portion of our panel that won't be recorded.